Okay, we'll be starting in 1 minute. So thanks everyone for joining early. Okay, why don't we get started? So thanks for everyone who's joined already. So are we doomed? Should we move? If so, to where? Should we have kids? Will technology save us? How will cities like New York, Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong, how are these places going to fare? Should we be optimistic about the future? I'm Arshad Chowdhury, managing partner at Betatron Venture Group. We're a VC firm that's based in Hong Kong, investing in early stage B2B startups across Asia, where businesses large and small are digitizing at a scale never seen before. So at Betatron, my team is asking these questions every day because their answers influence our investment decisions and how we look at the future. So we focus on industries like logistics, health tech, e-commerce, and I look after our adaptation and sustainability investments. We pride ourselves on being Asia's first carbon neutral VC fund, and we're also among the first to invest in climate adaptation solutions in the region. Here to help us answer these questions is Dr. Parag Khanna, a friend of mine, a geopolitical scholar. He is the best-selling author of 7 books, including his most recent called Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. He's the managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's and a master's degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. I'll be asking Parag for his views on these questions, and alongside that, I'll be offering some of our views at Betatron as to how we wrap those ideas into our investment thesis. So great to see you again, Parag. Thanks a lot for joining. How are you and where are you?
Very well. Thanks, Arshad. Great to see you again. And thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm so impressed with the breadth of your portfolio and its relevance to these kind of cutting edge questions of climate adaptation. And I think we'll probably get a chance to talk about how it applies to all the markets where you're investing. So I'm really looking forward to this. And I am in Singapore at the moment. I have been traveling again, which is great, but it's also nice to come home.
That's great. Welcome home. Glad you don't have the same quarantine policies that we have in Hong Kong. 21 days, very hard.
There is that.
So let's start with the big question: are we doomed? How do you answer that question?
You know, I was thinking about this earlier, and I was like, that is a great question. It's phrased differently from the way people typically think about these issues, which is more kind of gradual. So let me start with my very blunt answer, which is if you survive this pandemic, there's a very good chance that you also know how to survive climate change. You still may not know where you're going to do it, but you probably have the means to do so. You have the survival instinct, if you will, and you know, the resources at your disposal, and they're probably, and this is what happens psychologically, we are now conditioned and trained to think about these catastrophic disruptions like a pandemic or a major climatological event. So we've kind of got our spidey senses on. So again, if you've lived through this pandemic, then you, in your subconscious, are now attuned. So yes, the answer is yes, we're going to survive. So if you're alive now, then you're not doomed. But now the big caveat, I mean, a lot of places are doomed. A lot of people are doomed if they're not in the right places. And that's why, you know, especially in the wake of COP26, I argue that we need to talk a lot about climate adaptation, and climate adaptation for most people is going to mean migration. And so it comes down to, do you have the capacity or not to move depending on what disruption is coming your way?
Makes a ton of sense. And, you know, there are multiple migrations going on that we're all seeing, right? There's already that migration to cities, right? And then there's the climate migration. And there's also, the online migration. So many jobs are moving online. But I think of those, migrating for climate is sort of like not on people's minds yet in most places, including here in Hong Kong. And when I think about that answer, like, are we doomed? I think in a way, yes, we are certainly doomed to experience more wildfires, more extreme heat, weather events, strains on agriculture, like massive industries like real estate, insurance, these are going to suffer. And I worry that a lot of individual investors, university endowments, pension funds, they might be holding on to assets that are just way riskier than anyone has been led to believe. And I think climate risk or climate change related risk is just not accounted for. And for example, in New York, like the most valuable real estate in the US is, in the US, the most valuable real estate is in Miami, New York, Houston. These are some of the most vulnerable cities in terms of climate change. So I think today's conversation, it's not about like theoretical risks. In my mind, it's about the changes that are already here. And like in 2019, right, we saw the city of Chennai in India with a population of 11 million people. It ran out of water for 3 months, and 21 other cities in India could face that same fate this decade. And it was 118 degrees Fahrenheit in Siberia this past June. Right? Amazon, the Amazon is releasing more CO2 now than it absorbs. I think even if we achieve carbon neutrality today, it doesn't put that genie back in its bottle. So I think there's a real disconnect between how people think about what they're investing in generally and the direction that we all know the climate is heading. And most people I know are still planning to put all their savings into a down payment and then go into debt for like 30 years to buy a house, an asset that could quickly lose value because of climate change. So the problem is, to me, that we've historically underinvested in adaptation. And I think we have a visual for that. Calvin, if you can find that. I think in 2018, like $650 billion were invested in sustainability, but less than 3% of that went purely into adaptation. And so I think, how doomed we are depends very much on how that adaptation figure changes.
And right now, adaptation is like, still hovering at most 5 to 6% of total climate related investment. And at the UN at COP26, they called upon 50% of climate investment to become adaptation focused. That's quite a quantum leap that, let's face it, much like most other UN targets, we're not going to reach. So, these numbers in many ways just almost don't matter. They're not in the right ballpark, basically. We're not spending enough on mitigation for the reasons you just mentioned, given where greenhouse gas emissions are. We would need to, again, do massive geoengineering and decarbonization in order to really make a dent in temperature rise and to counteract the coal and the forest fires and all of that stuff. And then we would need to invest massively in adaptation because no matter what we do today, there are certain climate effects that are baked in. You mentioned 0-day water events. There are going to continue to be places where you're going to have severe and basically effectively permanent state of drought. And, it's happening in Kenya and so forth. So, even if you stop, this is a thought experiment that's pointless because it has no basis in reality. But if you were to stop all emissions tomorrow, you still live in water does not come back to places where it's disappeared. It's not going to happen, right? So, I think that we do have to start to as you and I obviously agree, invest much more in adaptation and the pricing mechanisms. One last thing on this, you mentioned that the real estate, we put numbers and values on these physical assets. It's a lie at this point, right? And, FEMA in the US has just come up with flood score 2.0, massive downgrade, massive hit to a huge share of the market. And that's just one of many regulatory indicators that's going to lead to a correction in asset prices above and beyond what climate damage itself is doing to those asset prices. One last thing though, Arshad, young people are fortunately not making those down payments. A lot are, but far fewer than would have been the case in the baby boomer generation and sort of Gen X. because young people are now a bit more risk averse. They're saying, you know what, I'd rather live in a trailer home. I'd rather go do Airbnb and bounce around, or do like kind of a home sharing rental membership thing, or move to Bali or Mexico, than be stuck in with a mortgage in a city or a town where you don't know if you're going to actually be there 2 or 3 years from now, or whether or not you've made the right bet in terms of climate change. So I have some hope that, again, the sixth sense, young people's sixth sense is pretty well honed, because they are the generation that's the most afraid of climate change.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think you shared with me a map of some of the climate impacts. Maybe Calvin, if you can find that. I think it'd be really interesting to unpack this a little bit. So help me think about moving, like do we need to move? And, who should be thinking about moving and on what kind of timeline? And help me unpack a little bit more, like what does this map mean to you?
Well, so this is a projection, or rather kind of an evolutionary snapshot of what happens to the suitability for human habitation of the geographies of the world as temperatures rise, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degrees. It kind of is jumping forward a bit and saying, on a relative basis, which places become less livable. So red does not mean you cannot live there now, right? It does mean that it is decreasingly livable as temperatures rise. Green means increasingly livable, even better than it is today. Now, that's a bit of a stretch in the sense that, as you just mentioned, Siberia here is green, but you've got forest fires in Siberia, and it's still cold in winter, and yet they're growing a lot of wheat. So, in some ways it's better, in some ways it's not better, so to speak. But that said, you're better off in a green zone than a red zone. I think we can probably all agree on that. But here's the crazy thing about this map. What it doesn't show you, what a lot of my other maps do, is the demographic overlay. So the majority of the human population in the world lives in areas that are red on this map. So the question is, will they stay in those red places? The answer is, well, they shouldn't. They shouldn't be forced to. It's immoral, and many of them will die. So what are we going to do about it? And, as you
just to pause you there for a second, like many of them will die. What time frame are you thinking about when you say that?
Well, it's happening already. Look at the deaths from floods, from typhoons, from heat waves. These kinds of phenomenon, are literally killing, tens of thousands of people any given time, right? So it's cumulative. Let's look at climate refugees. Let's look at those who survive. The number of climate refugees in this century is larger than the number of political or economic migrants. So already today, when you ask the question, what's the timeline? I'm like, the timeline is yesterday. Yeah. These places are already in the process of becoming redder. It's not like today is a perfectly hunky-dory T=0, and then moving forward, places start to turn red. Many of them are already red and getting redder, right? So we need to think of all of these things as relative and kind of evolving. But so here's the perverse thing, right? The majority of people in the world live in red zones. As you probably know, demographically speaking, we're actually reaching what I call peak humanity, right? The world population is going to decline soon. And the places where the world population is declining the fastest are the places that are in green. So here you have the ultimate paradox. And I mean this very literally, Arshad. I think this is the most perverse, ironic fact on the planet Earth today, is that the places in the world that are the most livable have declining populations, whereas the places that are becoming worse have the most people. I can't think of any more cruel and bitter fact or statement that you can make about life on planet Earth today than that one statement. And, there isn't some God-given solution to this. There isn't a solution from COP26. There isn't a solution from Joe Biden. There isn't a solution from Xi Jinping. Everyone needs to be educated and understand that we are the only way out of this. We have to figure it out. No one's going to tell us how to fix this. I have a solution. It's called mass population relocation and resettlement, but done so in an orderly fashion, in a sustainable fashion.
That's really profound, because what it means to me is that the biggest problems of this century are not necessarily directly related to climate change, but more the migration that it's going to cause, because that's going to cause so much friction culturally, legally, on our resources. I mean, it's a really incredible thing. I mean, in 1947, I think that was the last great migration between the partition of India, and that caused so much strife, death, violence along the way. And I worry about whether our systems, our countries are culturally ready for mass migration.
Well, so one of the most significant. Let's start with your point about whether our systems are ready, because I think this is really crucial. A lot of people are very negatively reactive to the notion of mass migrations, as if the future mass migrations are the first time it's ever happened. That's actually not true. We've been migrating and we've been nomadic as a species for 100,000 years. And actually, one of the things that we do best as a civilization is to migrate and absorb migrations. We're actually really good at it. Let's see, we're terrible at managing the environment. We're terrible at maintaining peace and security. We're terrible at establishing economic equality. One thing we're really, really incredibly good at, Arshad, is migration and absorbing migrants. That's why America is America. That's why Canada is Canada. That's why Britain is Britain. And Germany has become a migration magnet too. And look at Australia. So believe it or not, mass migrations are the thing that we do best. Now, it's not always for peaceful reasons. It could be a famine, like the Irish famine. It could be economic hardship, like Italy, and those are 19th century examples. It could be the slave trade during the colonial era. And it could be, of course, genocide and world wars, like, again, Europe in the 20th century. And of course, the partition of India and Pakistan was the largest single mass migration event of the 20th century. So there's positive and negative reasons. But what's the moral of the story from all of those examples? You're always better off when you move than if you stay. In so many of these cases, if you stay, you die. And it's kind of the same with climate change, in fact, in a much more blunt and obvious way. So I think that we need to be proactive about it and never lose sight of the fact that we're actually good at this. We can do this.
That's a great point. People ask me all the time, what are examples of climate adaptation startups, and what kind of startups are asset light that VCs can invest in? Because VCs are not going to invest in seawalls and massive infrastructure projects. So we at Betatron, we see immigration tech as a great example of an asset light climate adaptation investment. For example, we recently met a company called supervisas.com. They're automating the painful process of applying for visas. And we see a future where there's a common app for visas. Plug in your details, instantly understand the cost and likelihood of getting a visa to a different country. We're going to need tools like these to simplify, lower the cost, and accelerate the process of moving people. I mean, it's clear to me that we will need to move in large numbers, but Parag, where do you think people should move to? And I'm getting a sense from this map, but if you had your way, or if you must be asked this question all the time, where should people move to?
No, it's a great question, but geography matters a lot in answering it, and this is really fundamental. And the fact is that, let me say a couple of things. One, the majority of the human population on this planet, right? Well, we are all on this planet, except for the astronauts, right? The majority of the world population lives on one very big landmass, Eurasia, right? Whether you are Norwegian or whether you are from Thailand, guess what? You actually live on the same geological landmass of Eurasia. That's a really big deal, right? Your capacity for mobility is far greater than if you live in Paraguay or in the Congo. Because if you live on the continent of South America or the continent of Africa, it's way more difficult from a geographical standpoint to physically relocate. Look at the perilous journey that people make when they're trying to get from South America through Central America. Think about just the Darien Gap, let alone the struggles of Central America, and then the gangs and the sort of smuggling, and then getting to the Mexico border, the US-Mexico border, where guess what? You're not going to get across. Look at the Africans that are drowning in the Mediterranean and being shot and killed right now by Greek police and by Libyan militias as they try and make it across the Mediterranean, right? The Mediterranean is referred to by migration experts as a graveyard, right? And so, it's like the US and Europe are competing to be the most inhumane when it comes to migrants from South America and from Africa. Now, meanwhile, let's look at Asians migrating on the Eurasian landmass. Well, what are the two largest diasporas on the planet Earth? Chinese and Indian, right? Everywhere, right? Not necessarily moving freely, but with a long history of interpenetration across borders, despite any political obstacles or geological obstacles. Look at the growing population of Asians in Western Europe, and even the migration of Asians across the Pacific to America and Canada, huge and rising numbers. So the fact is that geology is not fair. So that's a very long kind of like preamble, but it makes a big deal. So when you say ideally, where should people go? It's like, well, your options are severely constrained by where you started your journey, right? And if you're Asian or European, you've got way more options than if you're African or South American, bottom line. So a lot of my work does focus on this Eurasian landmass, because if you want to save humanity, you first and foremost focus on the people of Eurasia, since that's 2/3 of human beings in the world, literally on one giant, it's what it's called in geopolitics. Eurasia is called the world island, right? It basically represents, other than, kind of obviously, again, North America, South America, and Africa, but again, way more people on Eurasia. So I'm focused to a large degree on the recirculation of people in Eurasia, because if you get that right, you've literally maximized the survival of most of the human species. And I don't mean that in a cold and brutal kind of, sort of dismissive way of other continents, right? Obviously, one of the largest population flows in the world is South Americans to North America. And I advocate for a lot more of that. And as you can see on this Africa map, there are many parts of Africa that are livable, right, and will be livable. So we need to think about circulation of people within Africa. And believe it or not, there's great African efforts around this, around making Africa borderless. The continent that has the most borders practically is trying to overcome them and become borderless. This is very, very promising stuff. And I hope that it succeeds. But in terms of, the law of numbers, if you will, I focus a lot of my attention on Eurasia for good reason, because of the size of the number of people there.
I see. Yeah. And this is all something I worry about firsthand because, my family is originally from Bangladesh, and, Bengalis are also, similarly everywhere. My cousins who I grew up with in Bangladesh are there now in the US, Australia, Canada, UK. They've spread all over the world. But growing up in Bangladesh, or growing up at least visiting Bangladesh just about every year, I watched that country go from, in my lifetime, 75 million people to 165 million people in population, and that's half the population of America living in a space the size of Wisconsin. It's a low-lying country where 18% of the country floods every year. I think my interest in adaptation is definitely born from my experiences in Bangladesh. But aside from flooding, there are like severe storms, and from Betatron's perspective, and this is just switching gears a little bit to think about going back to some of the impacts currently of climate change. We believe these storms are going to lead to tons of infrastructure decay all over the world. And one of our investments, a company called Sine, it helps ports around the world manage both their congestion and environmental factors. So like Sine puts sensors at the ports underwater, on the ground, and they can track things like sound underwater and air quality. So they can tell when there's a leak or an underwater explosion. So this is another example of an asset-light climate adaptation investment. And I
Very
think
timely, by the way. Well done.
that's right. Yeah, and I mean it's a great business too, because the ports have multi-year contracts and multi-billion-dollar contracts. So any company that can service them effectively and solve a really important problem is going to do really well as a business. So I guess we touched on whether we should move and where we should move, but I guess I want to dive into something else, which is should we have children? I hear so many young people say they're afraid to bring kids into this world, and they've got lots of good reasons for saying that. But what's your answer to that?
No, it's one of the most interesting sort of facts or trends and arenas of research that kind of I uncovered or stumbled upon when I was writing this book was this. And I mentioned it very briefly earlier, peak humanity. That's a term that I coined in this book because a lot of people have been saying that eventually the world population is going to decline and so forth. But because of the pandemic baby bust, and this is the second major baby bust in just over a decade after the financial crisis. Also, a lot of at that point it was kind of what are today older Gen X or younger Gen X kind of said, we're going to put off having kids. This financial crisis is very stressful. We'll have fewer kids or won't have kids at all. Now, when you have a baby bust, kind of like, let's say, the Great Depression or the Black Death, centuries ago, maybe it's a once in a lifetime thing. But the pandemic now, COVID-19, is the second baby bust in 10 freaking years, right? And this baby bust, Arshad, let me be very blunt, is way, way worse than what already was a terrible baby bust after the financial crisis, right? So in a span of just over a decade, we've had two mega baby busts where literally today's young people have decided not having kids. The first one was motivated by economic insecurity. The second one was also motivated by economic insecurity, but in the intervening decade plus, climate became a huge factor as well. So I cite some surveys where young people are basically saying that climate is their main motivation not to have children. And that is, I think for older people, really a shocker, but, not at all unsurprising when you spend time with young people and you interview them and you really sort of see how they've grown up and the way they've been raised to think. Because of course they are influenced by the present, not by our visions from the past of what the future should be, right? So this was one of the, and I'll tell you a couple more things. One, you cannot convince them otherwise, right? Don't even try. I've tried. I've got a couple kids. You got a couple kids. Don't try convincing a young person today. There may be some young people on this call. Can't wait to hear your opinions. But I've tried. I can't convince anyone under the age of 30 that they should have, more than one child, and some of them don't plan to have any kids, right? The second thing is that at a national or global scale, I have looked at the research and the efforts that many countries have made to induce fertility, right? France, Sweden, even Russia, tiny countries like Singapore, and even China now has said, never mind that one child policy, please have 3 children, right? I mean, that's literally what they're saying. There was even an economist who became kind of notorious in China. He said, maybe we need to have some form of like polygamy. A woman needs to marry 3 or 4 men and start just having lots of babies, that kind of thing. That didn't make him very popular among the women in China. But you know what? No matter. When you see headlines like that, don't pretend that they're actually going to happen, because they're not, right? I've traveled extensively in China, as have you, and I again talked to lots of Chinese people, and like they're not having kids. So the second point there is, again, no national program, no psychological conditioning, no heart-to-heart conversation between grandma and grandpa and grandkids is going to convince today's kids to have kids. Not happening.
Wow. Well, sadly, that's kind of an investable opportunity from Betatron's perspective. I mean, not only is there this demographic cliff, all these aging folks in huge countries, but you also have to look at the health of our older people today. Like in the US, 70% of the country is overweight and obese. The numbers are worse for even older people. And in India, you're seeing an epidemic of diabetes and hypertension because of the dietary changes that have happened over the last few decades. And because there are a few young people, there just aren't enough doctors and nurses to serve everybody. And this is why, from Betatron's perspective, telemedicine across Asia and any tools that might help scale the medical services are going to be valuable ones. And one of our investments called Fable is in India doing just that. They are helping Indians manage hypertension and diabetes, and they're growing incredibly quickly. So the demographic factor to us is also an interesting sort of climate adaptation play.
Well, we need to keep ourselves alive. That's part of what you're doing right there with that technology. We need to focus, obviously, on, longevity has been very successful, right? So that's why you have an aging world, but you also have the 4 billion young people and in the world today, and we want to ensure that they have healthy lifestyles and don't fall into some of the traps that we have as societies have modernized and gotten wealthier and diets have changed so rapidly and so forth. So I think that the sort of preventative measures, I mean, you're talking about very good obviously treatments and in a way preparation for people to cope with lifestyle diseases that they may have acquired. For today's young people, while they're still young and healthy, we really need to do a lot in preventative medicine and continue to work on longevity, because today's youth, if they're not having kids, they are the present and the future. And this is actually kind of a sci-fi point that I get at in the book. What I just said was the present is the future. So let me explain. Like for the last 100 years, every generation of people gave birth to a larger generation than itself. Hence, the world population rose from 2 billion people in 1920 to 8 billion people roughly by the end of the 20th century, right? And of course, it was driven, by countries all over the world, but you mentioned Bangladesh. India's population tripled also from independence until today. But now, of course, that's more or less stopped. So today's young people, if they're not having kids, they represent the largest share of the world population today, but they'll also be the largest share of the world population tomorrow because they're not having kids. So in other words, they are the present and they're also the future. So the present is the future. Now, again, it's literally never happened before. It's sci-fi, Arshad, like we're literally in sci-fi territory demographically. The present is the future. So everything, in other words, all of our medical systems, all of our climate policy, our entire economic structure, our housing markets, our fiscal expenditure, our educational systems, everything needs to be about today's young people because they are the present and the future.
It's so interesting. I learned from your book that we hear a lot about Japan's demographic issues, some aging population, kids aren't having children, younger people aren't having children, but China has the same problem, but just 10x the size, right? And that's interesting to me. And something that when the topic of kids comes up with people who don't have children, my take on it is that actually, if you do have kids and if they're well educated and healthy, they will have many more options than maybe any other generation before them because they're going to be needed. Their skills, they will be physically needed all over the world. And I see Josh Kareem is here. I know he is an expert in senior care in the US, and he's saying they're seeing older populations running out of qualified people to care for them as they age. And he's asking if we think climate change is having an impact on the labor shortages that we're seeing across the world today. A question from the audience. I wonder, how would you answer that, Parag?
Well, so let's focus primarily on the issue of the shortage of workers and the role of young people in that, because when you have aging societies and the workforce is shrinking, but you have to maintain infrastructure, care for the elderly, have construction workers, and in general wealthy societies that have high dependency ratios and large entitlement obligations need a tax base. Right? But if you don't have young people, you don't have active people in the workforce, who's paying the taxes? So therefore, it is, you might say, a great time to be a young and mobile person because you're needed around the world. There's jobs to be done, right? If countries will let you in, you will help them. Look at the United Kingdom right now, a shortage of 100,000 truck drivers, right? Again, United Kingdom today, a shortage of 50,000 nurses and doctors, right? And this is due to Brexit being compounded by COVID and a really bad government, right? So suddenly a country that has been over the past 200 years one of the most desirable metropoles for global talent and migrants, people switched off, sort of tuned out to the UK, and they're learning the hard way. So if you're a young person today with skills, and a passport, it might be one of the greatest times ever to be alive, provided you're not trapped in a climate, a place that's going to be really, sort of ruined by climate change, because there's dozens of countries that are begging to have you there. That's why the number of nomad visa schemes has grown from 2 countries to 75 countries. And you gave a great example earlier of, companies, startups that are helping to standardize and streamline visa applications and mobility and so forth. That's exactly what we need. I mean, a huge part of my book advocates for exactly this. Put passports on the blockchain. Have an app. Your passport should just be an app. This floppy paper with ink stamps is so passé, right? And today, in the age of QR codes to demonstrate that you have your vaccine, right? So QR vaccine certificates. Like, you can QR everything, right? I mean, look, you're in China. What is not QR in China, right? So as far as I'm concerned, your educational records, your travel history, your criminal history, your financial statements, everything that is required to gain access to another country, you can provide on a secure blockchain and limit the access, to that authority that needs to see it and verify it for that visa application. And boom, they send you a QR code, shows up on your phone, rock up at the border, scan your way in, right? I mean, we could do that yesterday, Arshad, we could. And this is one of these areas where I actually have hope that because of the pandemic, just like digitization has been this crazy hockey stick, right, due to COVID, well, post-COVID, we're going to move in some of these smarter new directions. And this is one of them, no doubt about it. And that will enable mobility, especially, of course, for young people. And again, let's tie it together. Why just young people? Well, young people who don't have kids, who don't have homes, aren't really rooted to any one place, are they? Right? And so today's youth are literally the most mobile generation in the history of the world, right? They're in demand because the old world needs young people. They have more digitization and opportunities to be mobile because of these standardizations that are happening through these, platforms to ease mobility. And they're not locked down by debt and a mortgage and children. I mean, the 2 reasons people don't move are 3 reasons: is they have a salary job, they own a home, and they have children. Well, let me tell you 3 things that the majority of the world's young people don't have. They don't own a home, they don't have children, and they don't have a steady job. So why would they be like our parents? They're not going to be like our parents. They're going to be mobile. So again, let's enable that mobility. Let's reconcile those demographic and labor gaps around the world by moving young people to where they are needed.
It makes a ton of sense. And, HR tech is something we definitely look at. We invest in global remittance systems as well, because a byproduct of this, of all this migration and moving for work is a rise globally of remittances. And it's not just to the traditional countries, like just back to Bangladesh or back to India. It's everywhere now. But I want to look at I want to talk about some of the wealthier cities like Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, New York, places that might have the resources to adapt. I wonder if they will be overwhelmed, if people living in those places should still consider moving, or if they can feel kind of like safe and feel protected by their relatively wealthy governments.
Great question. So, I have specific geographical chapters on the places that are kind of, rich cities that even if they are in what look like climate stressed areas on the map, might actually, still be able to survive because they're wealthy and can invest in environmental retrofitting and other adaptation mechanisms. So Singapore and Dubai kind of stand out because they actually have, 4 to 5 million people. They're in hot tropical or desert areas, but they're rich and they're investing in coastal barriers and raising roads and, domed, quasi districts, dome districts with air conditioning. So they are interesting experiments in terms of what might come next, in a way. And so I look at those places really carefully. Now, they're not mega cities of 40 million people, right? But again, it can become cheaper in terms of the technology that we deploy to do the things that they're doing. So they are really, really interesting. And I think that, again, even poorer cities will have to copy some of those practices for sure.
I'm living here in Hong Kong, and it's already quite hot and humid for much of the year. And it's sad to realize that it'll steadily get hotter, and we will see more extreme heat days every year. And in my lifetime, there's a chart we have here. You can see it was 20 or fewer in the red, very hot days. These are extreme heat days in a year. It's actually about 12 in the early 80s. And in 2020, it was 47 very hot days. And if you have kids, that means it's too hot for them to go outside and play football. They can't play outside for many months, actually. Sports have to move indoors or early in the morning or at night. And in Hong Kong, that's sort of like the extent of the pain in some ways. It's uncomfortable and definitely dangerous. But then when I think about places like India, where 50% of the population works in farming, hotter weather and changing weather patterns are just a disaster. So when I look at climate adaptation opportunities from Betatron's viewpoint, we look at drip irrigation technology, better predictive climate data, alternative methods of growing food. All of these things are ripe areas for innovation and investment, and incredibly necessary. While I think Hong Kong's, Singapore, Dubai, I think they have a better chance in many places, it's still going to be uncomfortable, isn't it?
I mean, it can very well be. I mean, again, the thing is, it's all relative, right? At any given time, if you have the means to move, but you're in a place that already is better off than most places, you may say, oh my God, it's getting so hot and muggy today. I don't feel like going outside. I wish I lived in Stockholm. Well, then maybe you have the means to go move to Stockholm. However, you may have, horrible heat waves in Stockholm, and you may find that Stockholm, guess what, has far lower percentage of air conditioning penetration than Hong Kong or Singapore. So right now, there are families in Dubai, European families, who traditionally in the summer will escape the heat and go to Europe. But because of the heat waves in Europe and the low air conditioning penetration, they're literally staying in Dubai in the summer, where technically it's hotter than Europe is getting, but at least you have air conditioning. So there's a paradox at play. It's like, wait, I'd rather stay in the desert than go to Europe in the summer. Why? Well, because of the infrastructure and the technology. So again, it could be more uncomfortable everywhere, but relatively speaking, where is it less uncomfortable? And this just reminds me, Arshad, I mean, one of my principal arguments is not that there is a perfect place, that there's one direction that people will go. Like, everyone should just move south to north. Again, a heat wave in Siberia is not pleasant. In 2010, I was literally driving through Siberia in the summer in a heat wave. I had no air conditioning. Siberia in the summer was miserable, not pleasant. So my argument becomes that we'll probably be more mobile and nomadic, and those who can, let's say, well, right now, where in the world is a nice, temperate, dry, not so hot place to be? Maybe I'll go there for a while, and then as it gets super cold there, you'll head south somewhere else. Now, not 8 billion people don't fly around on electric VTOL jets, right, in a carbon neutral Jetsons like circulation. So very few people get to do that now, and very few people will get to do it in the future. And therefore, of course, that's why climate adaptation is so important, right? Because the story I'm telling is not about billionaires with private jets and 6 passports. It's about 8 billion people and trying to make the places where they are livable or move them to places that are livable. I mean, I actually sum up the argument in just one sentence, which is you can either move people to resources or technologies to people. In a way, it's moral mission. You're doing such amazing things in your fund with these very relevant technologies, and in a way, you should sleep very soundly at night. I'm sure you do, and let me tell you why. Because I say, the question I ask is, if you want to measure whether you're doing anything good for the world, ask yourself this: are you moving people to resources or moving technologies to people? Right? I mean, if you're just flying a COP26 in a private jet and eating a steak, you didn't actually contribute to either of those statements, right? You didn't. You just didn't, right? So every day we need to ask ourselves: are we moving people to resources or technologies to people? Open and shut case. That's like my moral yardstick for everyone who can afford to be on a Zoom call right now. Ask yourself, what are you doing to make that come true?
It's a great question. It leads into the next one, which is about technology. Can technology save us?
I mean, yes, actually. I mean, it's almost easier to answer than the first question that we started with around if we're doomed. I mean, technology, yes, it can, and you don't have to be some kind of starry-eyed, naive, utopian, techno optimist to say that, right? It's a factual statement, right? I mean, technology already does save us all the time, not some future hypothetical you're asking. So the question is, which technologies, right? I mean, I bet we could do some amount of geoengineering right now. There's a huge number of debates around the hypothetical downsides. And if you haven't seen the movie Snowpiercer, that's one of the downside scenarios. There's others too. But I think we could commit a lot more capital to mild, let's say, geoengineering. There's so many. I mean, the list goes way too long. We could do high albedo surfacing. Painting everything white will reflect a lot of light. There are places right now in parts of Spain and elsewhere where they've cooled entire towns by just painting all the roofs white. So let's just get lots of white paint. Let's do it, right? We can again do atmospheric sulfur injection and reflect sunlight. We can do a million different things. We can do way more decarbonization, obviously, carbon capture, storage, nuclear power desalination. There's endless technologies today that can save us. Again, we've made a huge set of mistakes, right? I mean, climate change is our fault. We're not going to reverse it, because you can't reverse a complex system. In physics and math, complex systems don't ever return to some steady state, right? There's always the next phase and the next phase. It only moves forward, never backwards, right? The laws of chaos can't be reversed. So whatever comes next is going to be different. It's not, the climate of 2025 is not going to look like the climate of 1995 or 1800, even if you stop all emissions today. But you could certainly slow down the rate of climate change and get a grip on what is happening to different places and try to restore certain habitats. We can plant 1 trillion trees. That's not necessarily a very high-tech solution, but guess what? It would be better than not planting 1 trillion trees, right? So yes, I mean, technology can save us. We just, we're not scaling, obviously, as rapidly as we should.
When I think about that, and I really appreciate all of that, and I tend to agree with you, especially when it comes to whether we should slow down in terms of consumption and leaning to technology, or if we should accelerate. I think there's a term for it, the degrowth folks in versus the eco-modernists. And I think the eco-modernists are the ones who believe, yeah, we should lean into nuclear, maybe even continue to invest heavily in technologies. And I think both have their strengths in terms of the viewpoints, but I believe we're going to have very low cost renewable energy just right around the horizon. And I think it's just like COVID though, like we have vaccines, but we don't have the global coordination, political systems, even the shared beliefs needed to deploy the vaccines, right? And there's a chart here on the global percentage of electricity from renewable sources. Thanks, Calvin. It's just, it's undeniable that more and more of our power is coming from renewables. I think as climate change, as weather patterns get more erratic, even though we have these technologies, we're still going to need redundancy in supply chains and more transparency in markets everywhere, because we're going to see shortages of food in some places, and we're going to see more reliable access in other places as weather becomes more erratic. So Betatron invests in companies like Bangladesh-based logistics company that makes it easy to find and hire commercial trucks. And that was critical during the pandemic lockdowns in getting medical supplies and food to people while everything else came to a standstill. Another area in the supply chain that we're investing in is maritime shipping. We look at companies like Freightify, who we've invested in. It's a marketplace for freight forwarders. Just making it easier to connect buyers and sellers all over the world, especially in a time when supply chains are unpredictable. So I think technology is going to play an incredible role in just helping us cope with the near-term, really major changes and kind of like violent weather we'll be facing. And in the long term, I feel like we're not going to survive without technology, but it's also just a juggernaut, right? You can't stop it. You can't turn it back. Which brings me to the last point, which is, are you feeling optimistic about humanity's future?
I mean, it's just an amazing kind of intellectual journey, that this research has taken me on. I mentioned the peak humanity thing, which is a real eye opener. And then, vaguely earlier, I was alluding to this idea of the kind of sixth sense, And when I really take that big step back, I say to myself, what if we are subconsciously, collectively self-correcting? I mean, declining our own population by way of everything from birth control in the 60s and 70s, reducing our fertility, young people not wanting to have kids. It's a way of saying, wait a minute, there's something wrong. We've got to slow down our complexity, the spiraling, hurtling, accelerating train that we're on. Let's reduce our numbers. Let's, fix our, economy, restructure, not, maybe or maybe not degrowth. I don't want to, there's econometric arguments on both sides there, but just doing things more sustainably and self-correct and bring our numbers on a glide path down and then see what happens, right? Societies of the past, civilizations that have become too complex for their own good and failed to untangle that complexity have collapsed. So what we're right now, Arshad, we are the doctor and the patient, right? Literally, we're the doctor and the patient. We're operating on ourselves, reducing our own population, rapidly transitioning towards renewable energy, relocating ourselves geographically. All of this is happening at the same time in this uncoordinated set of movements and initiatives and efforts, because we're all actually like, ants in that colony and we're all doing little things that will contribute to our collective survival. So when you ask, am I optimistic or pessimistic? It's like, I think we have the capacity, to survive. And so I often call myself, I'm sort of an accidental optimist. I wouldn't be an optimist about our capacity for collective action diplomatically, right? Look at what a joke some of our summitry is, and what a waste of time and resources it is, right? So when you look at it in that way, you would be pessimistic. But when you look at the actions from the bottom up, so top down versus bottom up, right? You can be a top down pessimist and a bottom up optimist in a way. And that's kind of where I might come down right now on that. So I have faith in humanity. I'm not sure I have faith in our leaders.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, if I were going to answer that question, I think we're going to make it. As a species, we've made so many great advances already. Literacy is up globally since I was born, to like from 66% up to 86% today. And global poverty rates have been falling for like decades straight, right? The percentage of people who have access to drinking water is higher than ever. There's less likelihood of dying from wars or being murdered than ever before. And that's in a world full of full of despots, full of income inequality, labor violations, thriving criminal organizations. And we're still able as a species to make these really great improvements. And I think it's definitely true that climate change is going to happen at a pace that we've never seen before. And our current systems and governments, they're not ready. But as we go forward, we'll be armed with better technology than our species has ever had. And I think the cost and efficiency of our technology, specifically processing power and AI, these are improving exponentially. And they lead to better weather forecasting, more medical breakthroughs, cheaper housing, more efficient food production. So there's definitely room, from my perspective, for optimism. So I want to pause to take some questions from the audience, and I think you can ask those questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Either one works. And the first one that we have, Parag, maybe you want to take a stab at this. It's, wouldn't governments imposing a universal carbon tax be the most efficient way to slow the rate of climate change?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that a carbon tax is probably rightly portrayed as certainly the most efficient, effective, top-down, if internationally coordinated, also effective measure to immediately shift incentives, and to promote a more rapid energy transition. But the devil is in the details. It's sort of, it'd be easy to wave a wand and do it. But the system that we already have almost, is created a lot of perverse incentives. You have so many companies buying carbon credits, so still being huge emitters, but buying offsets, and that's sort of a financial instrument. But at the end of the day, if you're still producing emissions, you're still part of the problem, not the solution. And then, diplomatic tensions over carbon taxes as well, because it's like we offshore production to countries, then we want to tax imports from those countries because they're heavy polluters, because they're making stuff for us, right? So it's like, this is basic globalization and economics almost clashes with this regulatory impulse, which is a fine idea, but implementing it is very, very hard. So I think at the end of the day, if you view this, the only number that matters, right? And I've heard a lot of climate scientists passionately say this: talk all you want about $100 billion for this and 50% of expenditure for that, and this budget until then, and so on. And the Green Climate Alliance saying $130 trillion of asset under management are now, managed through ESG principles. And the climate scientists are like, you know what? The only number that matters is parts per million, sort of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. You're not bringing that down. You're just talking. right? Hot
There have
air.
been 26 of these meetings, and that number has only increased, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fair. So there's another question from my partner, Matthias, who's asking, what are your thoughts on the impacts of climate change / migration on inequality going forward?
Great question. Thanks, Matthias. Matthias, the fittest man in Asia, I think, if I'm not mistaken, right?
He runs ultra marathons in places. He's amazing.
Yeah. So climate migration and inequality. Okay, so the generic answer is don't think of it as just climate migration and inequality, but just migration. So, the fact is that one of the most important, mechanisms for creating economic opportunity has been migration. Because even though on the one hand you have a brain drain effect, you also have a huge volume of remittances. And the aggregate annual amount of remittances in the world from rich countries to poor, from poor people in rich countries to their families and communities in poor countries, is about the same as the volume of foreign investment into those countries. So it's existentially important to reduce poverty, that we have migration, right? So again, poor people come to rich countries, send money back. It's a very arithmetic thing. And climate migration is important in the same way that that other categories of migration have evolved and pushed this phenomenon. But if it means that the rich world gets richer because poor people have gone there and they get richer, and the poor world stays poor because the amount of money that's being sent back and the investment is not enough to elevate them, then yeah, statistically, inequality is getting worse. But the fact is that up until the pandemic hit, global inequality between North and South was actually starting to shrink and to reduce, because where is the growth in the world economy? Well, of course, the higher growth rates have been in poorer countries, right? Whether it is Latin America, Africa, and of course, Asia, and the developing markets of Asia. So we have been doing a good job of reducing inequality between North and South. It has happened in lockstep with greater migration. I don't think that's an accident, right? I think that they are linked causally. There are many other causes, but that's one of them. But now with the pandemic, of course, what have we seen? Well, the gap has widened. The pandemic has hurt poorer countries much more severely. And of course, migration has stopped. Again, not an accident, right? When remittances dry up, less money comes in, investment has slowed because of the pandemic, poorer countries have gotten poorer, right? So I do think that we do have to keep these issues linked, which is the very correct spirit of the question, and keep that in mind when we think about how we're resettling people and how they're earning and where they're earning and how mobile that money is. You mentioned investing in remittance companies, and that is one of the categories or verticals that I consider the most heroic and moral, is creating a frictionless ability for people to transfer financial resources around the world, and the fruits of their labor to directly share that on a peer-to-peer basis, with as little friction and taxation intervening as possible, is one of the truly, important things that we do for humanity to help itself.
Thanks for that. That's great. Great way to look at it. Another question we have, which I love because it gets us thinking 50 years, 100 years in the future, where will the centers of power be in 50 to 100 years, given the demographic / effects of climate change?
Where will what be in 50 to 100 years?
The centers of power.
So it's very interesting. Remember, we were talking earlier about how, the fact of geography is that, people have a more difficult time relocating from, island continents that are offshore of the major economic centers like Africa and South America. So similarly, geopolitics and great power politics has basically always been a northern hemispheric kind of game, right? And the three major economic and strategic power centers of the world today are North America, Europe, and Asia. And of course, Europe and Asia share a continent but are distinct economic zones and demographic zones and cultural zones and have their own political systems and so forth. So these are the three power centers of the world today. And again, North America as a whole, although not, of course, Louisiana and Florida, and in the southwest of the US, places where climate change is having a very negative impact. But North America as a whole is a propitious, continent. Europe, according to those maps that we were looking at earlier, looks, quite okay despite climate change. And much of Asia, North Asia, you might say, remember that Eastern Russia is North Asia, right? Like North Asia. So, the three power centers of the world strategically and economically also are quite all right due to climate, despite climate change. So the question is more, how do they retrofit their economies, adapt their infrastructures, absorb new populations, and that kind of thing. So in other words, 10, 20, 30 years from now, the Northern Hemisphere in general is still going to be the place to be, but not, again, in a sense, like I was saying earlier, it doesn't mean that each place is going to be perfectly stable and the place, because there are forest fires in Greenland and Alaska and Siberia. So you got to pick your spots, obviously. But generally speaking, I do think that with large scale population relocation, there will be within those major zones new power centers. So like Canada is going to be more important in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. The Great Lakes region, states like Michigan, are going to have a revival, right? In Europe, Scandinavia becomes more important than it has been, right? Parts of Russia that have been derelict and dilapidated in the post-Soviet era are going to revive. Countries like Kazakhstan that have been, post-colonial and almost, they were neglected, landlocked countries for a long time, are going to have huge populations and diversified economies. So within those geographies, that's, 7 or 8 examples right there of, real coherent new power centers, but within the existing geographical framework of places that you more or less know are going to be better off than the rest of the world.
All right, and we have another question from my friend Kofi, who I believe is in New York. It is thinking about what drives investors in the broader private capital space. What is your view on the transition to more climate change conscious investing? Will investors shift to this on their own, or will political forces be required to start shifting dollars? I think I can take a go. Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. I just spent much of the week at a private equity and venture capital forum here in Hong Kong, and virtually every speaker, every big private equity fund has a plan and commitments around ESG. But what was also consistent was that many of those commitments were carbon neutrality in 2050 for their portfolio companies. And you knew that just by the ages of the fund managers making those announcements that they would not be managing the funds in 2050, responsible for the outcomes. And they probably have plenty of passports and options as to where to go if things don't work out. My feeling is that also in many places, the investor class is also setting the agenda, the political agenda, by way of like very effective lobbying in defense of their interests. So I think yes, there's definitely a lot of interest in environmental in ESG related investing, but so far it feels more like a checking the box exercise. And yeah, I do think that political forces will be required, but where will those political forces come from is a question, especially when you have sort of like captive government agencies. But I do also think that reality will set in very quickly, right? And I think you already have local insurance companies in places like Miami that don't insure locally. You already have governments deciding that they're going to not allow new construction in places that get flooded. And these are the beginnings of sort of, I guess, retracting or strategic retreat, which is kind of an expensive proposition, but one that I think we have to take on. And I think large insurance companies, large real estate investors are, if they haven't already, they're going to start absorbing the reality of how dangerous it is to be investing in climate susceptible places. Parag, what do you think?
Look, I mean, you're absolutely spot on around all of this. I mean, it's now, I mean, it could be that the rhetoric still outpaces the reality, right? We talked about this climate finance alliance and, what people say they're going to commit, but, we still have obviously many publicly listed equities that are obviously from the fossil fuel industry. And yes, they're divestment campaigns, but again, let's go back to what's ultimately the metric, are emissions being reduced or not? And you've still got coal-fired power plants being built and this kind of thing. But, and so, my answer before was the very pithy one, both, right? It's going to be voluntary action and, leadership emerging from within the industry that sees a financial opportunity to be a market maker in a space that is going to be more heavily regulated, but also that regulation itself. So, and I think that is the normal course of things, that the answer is both. But it's going to take a lot more of both, and a lot faster would be my kind of expansion on that answer.
All right, thank you. We have another question from the audience. To increase sustainability and resilience of remittance flows, wouldn't you have to eliminate corrupt and duplicitous recruitment agencies who profit enormously off of employment and climate-related migration, and actively drain massive cuts of remittance flows? Would investing in companies that support ethical recruitment agencies in Asia be one way to tackle labor-related migration in Asia and improve resilient remittance flows? Really great question. I'd love to hear your take on it, Parag.
Well, I mean, two things. One is, we are cutting out the middleman. That's what companies, like those you invest in are doing, so peer-to-peer financial services, apps, mobile wallets, crypto as well, eliminate the middleman, right? You don't go to Western Union and say, I want to send a Bitcoin or Ether to my relative in Bangladesh. You just send them and send it to their wallet. You don't have to go up to any counter and pay any fee to some unscrupulous kind of intermediary, right? So that's one way to get around it. But when it comes to migration itself, this is very important, because there are diplomatic efforts around what's called safe and orderly migration. So actually looking at this industry that really treats humans as cogs in a sort of supply chain, and the steps that people go through to migrate, how they get their visas, how they cross borders, what borders they cross, the whole coyote kind of thing, smuggling sort of thing of people, and how do you certify this business, of enabling and facilitating mobility, or try to stamp out the illegal dimensions of this. This is actually very important as well. So not necessarily directly related to remittance flows, but definitely a matter of human dignity that we support those efforts. And there now is, as of last year, a global compact around this. Unfortunately, it's not binding, but it's a step in the right direction.
Love that. Thanks for that. Makes a lot of sense. I think that's it for the open questions. If anybody else has questions, you can go ahead and ask it either in the chat, or you can ask it in the Q&A. If we don't get any in the next couple minutes, I think we can start wrapping up. Parag, this has been a really great conversation. You and I have connected on these issues before, and I'm sure we will again in the future. I think the work that you're doing is incredibly important. I definitely recommend that everyone on this call get the book Move. I know I learned a lot from the book, and I'm sure you will too, and let other people know about it. You can find this conversation and others like it on the Investing in Asia podcast by Betatron. I want to thank of course, Parag for joining us today. Also to Calvin, our analyst at Betatron, who helped us set this up and who's been doing a lot of research in the background for us. And thank you everyone who joined today. My name is, again, Arshad Chowdhury, managing partner at Betatron Venture Group, and our website is at betatron.co. So with that, I'd like to end the webinar, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.